Hello, and welcome to Some Neuromind. I'm glad you're here tonight. Maybe the day presented you with a decision that logic alone couldn't fully resolve. A moment where something inside you leaned one way before the reasoning had caught up. Or perhaps you simply find that the mind unwinds more easily when it has something genuine to think about, something that reaches into the texture of your own experience rather than floating away from it. Either way, this is a good place to be. Tonight we're going somewhere closer than the ocean floor and more intimate than the stars. We're going inside. Not into the biology of the brain in the clinical sense, but into one of the most quietly remarkable things the mind does. The process of knowing something before you can explain why. That flicker of certainty that precedes the argument. That sense of rightness or wrongness that arrives before the evidence has assembled itself into a clear case. That moment when the body has already decided and the conscious mind is only beginning to catch up. We call it intuition. And it turns out to be one of the most studied, most debated, and most genuinely fascinating aspects of human psychology. Tonight, we're going to explore what it actually is, not mystically, not dismissively, but carefully and with great respect for how strange and how useful it turns out to be. Before we begin, if Some Neuromind helps your mind find a quieter place at the end of the day, consider subscribing. You're already the kind of person this channel was made for, one quiet mind at a time. There's a great deal to explore tonight. Before we're done, you'll encounter an idea about why your gut feelings are sometimes more accurate than your conscious analysis, and something about what happens to intuition when you're under stress that might change how you approach difficult moments. But there's no hurry at all. We'll go slowly and gently and with care. Let's begin. Intuition is not the opposite of reason. It is a different form of it. The common idea that intuition and logic are opposites, that you're either a feeling person or a thinking person, doesn't match what psychology and neuroscience have found. Both are forms of information processing. The difference is that analytical reasoning is slow, deliberate, and conscious. It works through steps, checks its own work, and produces conclusions you can explain in words. Intuition is fast, largely unconscious, and pattern-based. It draws on everything your brain has stored and delivers a conclusion in the form of a feeling rather than an argument. Neither is inherently more reliable. Both are tools, and understanding when to use each one is a skill that develops over a lifetime. The brain processes far more information than consciousness can hold. Every moment you are awake, your senses deliver an enormous stream of data, sounds, visual details, smells, tactile sensations, the emotional tone of the people around you, the quality of the light, the micro-expressions crossing someone's face too quickly to register consciously. Your conscious mind can handle only a fraction of this. The rest is processed beneath awareness, and some of it influences your behavior and your feelings without ever surfacing as a clear thought. When something feels off in a room you've just entered, before you can name what's wrong, what you're feeling is the product of that unconscious processing. Your brain has noticed something your attention hasn't focused on yet. Intuitive feelings arrive in the body before they reach the mind. One of the most consistent findings in the psychology of intuition is that gut feelings often manifest as physical sensations before they become conscious thoughts. A tightening in the chest, a subtle quickening of breath, a vague heaviness in the stomach, a feeling of ease or of resistance. These are not random. They are the body's way of communicating what the brain has already processed. The somatic marker hypothesis, developed by neuroscientist Antonio Damasio, proposes that the brain marks past experiences with emotional tags, stored memories of how similar situations felt, and that these tags are reactivated when similar patterns are encountered, generating the physical sensations we experience as gut feelings. Intuition, in this view, is the body reading its own emotional memory. People who have lost the ability to feel emotions often make worse decisions, not better ones. This is one of the most counterintuitive findings in decision science. Patients with damage to the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, a brain region important for emotional processing and the generation of somatic markers, often score normally on tests of logic and reasoning. They can analyze options clearly and articulate the pros and cons of a decision with apparent precision. Yet in real life, they struggle enormously with ordinary decisions. They may spend hours choosing where to sit in a waiting room. They make poor financial choices despite knowing the relevant facts. The absence of emotional guidance doesn't free them to be more rational. It paralyzes them. Emotion, it turns out, is not noise in the decision-making system. It is part of the signal. Intuition improves with domain-specific experience. One of the most important findings about intuition is that it is not uniform across areas of life. A chess grandmaster has extraordinarily reliable intuitions about chess positions. They can look at a board for a moment and know whether a position is strong or weak long before they've consciously analyzed it. But that same grandmaster has no special intuitive ability when it comes to reading the stock market or diagnosing medical conditions. Intuition is essentially expertise compressed into feeling. It develops in direct proportion to the amount of meaningful experience you have in a particular domain. An experienced nurse can sometimes sense that a patient is deteriorating before any measurable vital sign is changed. A seasoned firefighter can feel that a burning building is about to do something dangerous before they can name the specific cues. The feeling is real, but it is built from thousands of previous encounters, not from anything mystical. The recognition prime decision model describes how experts use intuition under pressure. Psychologist Gary Klein spent years studying how experienced decision-makers, firefighters, military commanders, intensive care nurses, made choices under pressure in complex, rapidly changing situations. What he found was that they rarely deliberated between options. They didn't generate a list of possibilities and evaluate them in parallel. Instead, they recognized the situation as a type, one they'd encountered before, or something close to one they'd encountered before, and that recognition immediately suggested an action. They then ran a quick mental simulation of the action. Would it work? If the simulation felt right, they proceeded. If something felt off, they adjusted. This recognition prime decision process is intuition operationalized in high-stakes environments. And it works, but only when the person has built up the experience base that makes their pattern recognition reliable. Expert intuition requires feedback to develop and stay accurate. A crucial insight from research on intuition and expertise is that good intuition in a domain requires not just experience, but feedback. You need to learn whether your intuitive judgments were right. In what researchers call kind learning environments, feedback is rapid, accurate, and clearly linked to specific decisions. Chess is a kind environment. The game proceeds, and you see the consequences of your moves. Surgery can be a kind environment for certain skill-related decisions. But many real-world domains are unkind learning environments. Feedback is delayed, ambiguous, or absent. A financial advisor may recommend an investment and not learn for years whether it was wise. And by then, so many other factors have intervened that the link to the original decision is obscured. In unkind environments, people can develop strong intuitive confidence that is poorly calibrated. They feel certain about things they have not actually learned to predict well. Intuition can be systematically wrong in predictable ways. Knowing that intuition is powerful in the right conditions also means knowing when it fails. Psychologists Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky spent decades documenting the ways in which human intuitive judgment deviates systematically from statistical accuracy. We are poor at estimating probabilities, particularly small ones. We weight recent or vivid examples too heavily when judging how common something is. We are strongly influenced by how a question is framed. We tend to see patterns in random sequences. These are not character flaws. They are tendencies built into the architecture of a system optimized for speed and pattern recognition in a world that was, for most of human history, more predictable than the modern environment. Understanding these tendencies is not a reason to distrust intuition entirely. It is a reason to know when to supplement it with slower, more deliberate checking. Availability bias makes vivid memories feel like reliable guides to frequency. One of the most pervasive biases that can corrupt intuitive judgment is the availability heuristic, the tendency to estimate how likely something is based on how easily examples of it come to mind. Events that are emotionally vivid, recent, or personally experienced feel more common than they are, simply because they are easier to retrieve from memory. A plane crash receives enormous news coverage and generates intense emotional responses, making air travel feel more dangerous than it statistically is. A disease with a striking name and a famous sufferer feels more threatening than a statistically more common condition that receives less attention. When intuition draws on availability, it can systematically overestimate rare but dramatic risks and underestimate common but mundane ones. Recognizing this doesn't neutralize the bias, but it creates a pause, a moment to ask whether what feels likely is actually likely or simply easy to remember. Confirmation bias can dress itself as intuition. Once a belief or suspicion is in place, the mind tends to selectively notice information that supports it and overlook information that contradicts it. This is confirmation bias, and it is particularly insidious when it takes the form of intuitive certainty. A manager who has decided, perhaps on the basis of limited initial evidence, that an employee is underperforming will tend to notice and remember the mistakes more readily than the successes. This selective attention generates a feeling of certainty that can feel like deep intuition, a strong sense of knowing, when it is actually the product of biased sampling. One practical check is to actively search for disconfirming evidence, to ask not what supports the hunch, but what would have to be true for the hunch to be wrong, and whether any of those things might in fact be true. The anchoring effect can distort intuitive numerical judgments. When people are given a starting number before making an estimate, their final estimate tends to be pulled toward the starting number, even when they know the starting number is arbitrary. This is the anchoring effect, and it operates largely below consciousness. In negotiation, the first number offered tends to anchor the conversation. In medical diagnosis, the first condition considered tends to exert a pull on subsequent thinking. In everyday decision-making, any number you happen to encounter before making an estimate, even an unrelated one, can bias the result. Intuitive numerical judgments are particularly susceptible to anchoring because they feel direct and unmediated, with no obvious place for an external influence to enter. But it enters anyway, through the back door of unconscious processing. Sleep consolidates learning and often improves intuitive judgment by morning. There is a good reason that the advice "sleep on it" has persisted across cultures and centuries. Sleep is not merely a period of rest for the brain. It is a period of active processing, during which the hippocampus replays experiences and the cortex consolidates newly acquired patterns into long-term memory. For intuition specifically, sleep can be genuinely clarifying. A problem that seemed intractable in the evening sometimes reveals a clear direction by morning, not because new information has arrived, but because the sleeping brain has had time to integrate what was already known. Research on creative insight and on skill learning consistently shows that sleep-dependent memory consolidation produces improvements in performance and judgment that are not attributable to additional practice alone. Allowing the mind to rest is not avoiding the problem. It is, in some cases, the most productive thing you can do with it. The aha moment is a real neurological event. The experience of sudden insight, the feeling that something that was obscure has suddenly become clear, often arriving without apparent effort after a period of either rest or distracted attention, has been studied in neuroimaging experiments that reveal what happens in the brain at the moment of insight. In the seconds before a person reports an aha moment, there is a distinctive burst of activity in the right hemisphere of the brain, particularly in the anterior temporal lobe. This activity is preceded by a brief narrowing of visual attention and sometimes by increased alpha wave activity, which is associated with a relaxed, internally focused mental state. The insight is not random. It is the product of unconscious processing that has been quietly running in the background, assembling pieces that the conscious mind hadn't yet connected. The aha arrives when that assembly is complete. Incubation periods allow unconscious processing to work on problems. The phenomenon of incubation, the fact that walking away from a difficult problem often leads to better solutions than continuing to stare at it, is one of the most robust findings in the psychology of creativity and problem solving. When you stop consciously working on a problem, the conscious mind's grip on it loosens. You stop fixating on the approaches that haven't worked. The problem continues to be processed in a diffuse, less focused way, and new associations, connections that were blocked by the tunnel vision of effortful concentration, can form more freely. The insight that emerges from incubation often arrives during activities that involve a different kind of attention: walking, showering, the moments between sleep and waking. These transitions into lighter cognitive states seem to be particularly fertile ground for the sudden surface of unconsciously prepared solutions. Intuition about people is shaped by very rapid first impressions. Research by psychologist Nalini Ambady on what she called thin slices of behavior showed that people can make surprisingly accurate judgments about others from very brief exposures, sometimes as brief as a few seconds of silent video. Judgments about a teacher's effectiveness, for example, made from 30-second clips with the sound removed, correlated significantly with end-of-semester student evaluations. These thin-slice judgments are not infallible, and they are subject to all the biases that affect other forms of intuitive judgment. But they suggest that the brain is extracting and integrating meaningful social signals even from minimal information, and that these rapid judgments capture something real about the interaction style and personality of the person being observed. The first impression is not simply prejudice. It often contains genuine signal and genuine noise in roughly equal measure. Microexpressions are brief emotional signals that intuition can detect. The human face is capable of an enormous number of expressions, and most of them are produced and read automatically, without conscious intention on either side. Among the most important for social intuition are microexpressions. Extremely brief, involuntary facial expressions that last for only a fraction of a second before being suppressed or replaced by a more composed expression. They occur when a person experiences a genuine emotion that they are attempting to conceal or control. Most people cannot consciously identify microexpressions when they see them, but research suggests that the brain processes them regardless, generating a vague sense of unease or incongruence that surfaces as a feeling that something doesn't quite fit. When you sense that someone is not being fully honest without being able to say exactly why, You may be responding to microexpressions or other nonverbal signals that your unconscious processing has caught, but your conscious attention missed. The body keeps a record of social safety and danger. Your nervous system is continuously evaluating the people and environments around you for signals of safety or threat, largely below the level of conscious awareness. This evaluative process, described by Stephen Porges in his polyvagal theory, operates through the autonomic nervous system and influences your physiological state, your behavior, and your felt sense of a situation. When the nervous system detects safety, in the form of calm facial expressions, prosodic voices, appropriate eye contact, and responsive body language, it settles into a state that supports social engagement, openness, and ease. When it detects threat cues, even subtle ones that never reach conscious awareness, it shifts toward protective states, guardedness, withdrawal, or activation. Much of what we experience as social intuition is this continuous, automatic evaluation made available to consciousness as a feeling about a person or a place. Intuition in leadership often comes down to reading the room accurately. Leaders who are consistently described as having good instincts, who seem to know when a team is losing confidence, when a strategy needs to change, or when a relationship is in trouble before the problem has become explicit, are often people who have developed a finely tuned sensitivity to subtle social signals. They notice when the energy in a room changes. They hear the difference between a team member's verbal agreement and their emotional commitment. They sense when enthusiasm in a meeting is performed rather than genuine. These are not mystical abilities. They are the product of years of attention to human behavior, calibrated by feedback and refined by experience. The person who leads well often does so partly because they have developed, through sustained effort and reflective practice, an intuition about people that is genuinely more accurate than average. Pattern recognition in music is a form of trained intuition. A musician who has spent years playing and listening develops an intuitive grasp of harmonic structure, rhythmic feel, and melodic tendency that goes far beyond anything they could articulate in words. They hear a chord and feel where it wants to go. They play in an ensemble and know, without thinking, when to lead and when to follow. This is intuition built through thousands of hours of focused, feedback-rich experience, the same mechanism that operates in any expert domain, expressed here in the language of sound. When you listen to music that seems to know exactly where it's going, that feels inevitable even the first time you hear it, you are often responding to the composer's or performer's own deep pattern recognition. Intuitions about what the music wants to be that were refined over a lifetime of listening and playing. Children show early forms of intuitive reasoning that adults often underestimate. Very young children, long before they have the vocabulary to articulate their reasoning, demonstrate intuitive grasps of physical causation, social relationships, and numerical magnitude. Infants as young as a few months old show surprise when objects appear to violate physical laws, suggesting an implicit model of how the world works that predates any formal learning. Toddlers intuitively prefer fair distributions of resources and are sensitive to social reciprocity. Children pick up the rules of grammar not by being taught them explicitly, but by unconscious pattern extraction from the language they hear. Much of what we call intuition in adults is the adult expression of these early developing capacities, systems tuned by both evolution and experience to extract and use patterns quickly, in service of navigating a world that rarely pauses to explain itself. Emotions are information, not interference. One of the most persistent misconceptions about decision-making is that emotions corrupt judgment and that the best decisions are made by suppressing feeling and relying on pure reason. The evidence does not support this. Emotions carry information about the significance of things, about what matters, what is dangerous, what is worth pursuing, what should be avoided. Appropriately calibrated emotions, responsive to the actual features of a situation, improve decision quality. The problem is not emotion itself, but miscalibrated emotion. Emotion that is too intense for the situation, drawn from irrelevant past experiences, or distorted by bias. The goal is not to silence the emotional signal, but to learn to read it accurately, to distinguish genuine information from noise, and to use emotional data alongside rather than instead of analytical reasoning. Anxiety and fear can mimic intuition in ways that are difficult to distinguish. One of the most practically important challenges in working with intuition is learning to tell the difference between a genuine signal and the output of an anxious mind. Anxiety generates sensations, tightening, racing thoughts, a feeling of foreboding that can feel indistinguishable from the felt sense of a real warning. But anxiety is often generated by what the mind imagines rather than by what the environment is actually presenting. A genuine intuitive warning tends to be specific. It points towards something particular, carries a quality of observation rather than catastrophizing, and can often, in retrospect, be traced to specific cues the nervous system had registered. An anxiety response tends to be more diffuse, more self-referential, and more prone to escalation when attention is directed toward it rather than away from it. Learning to make this distinction is not simple, and it is a skill developed over time rather than instantly acquired. Creative intuition involves making unexpected connections across domains. Many of the most significant creative insights in history have come from people who brought knowledge from one domain to a problem in a different domain, making a connection that specialists within that domain had missed. This cross-domain intuition seems to be facilitated by breadth of knowledge combined with deep familiarity in at least one area. The broader your exposure to different fields, the more material your unconscious processing has to work with when looking for non-obvious connections. Some of the most creative people are those who have pursued genuine depth in more than one domain, who know enough about music and mathematics to hear a structural similarity that others have overlooked, or who understand biology and engineering well enough to see that a solution from one domain applies to a problem in the other. Breadth is not the opposite of depth. In the service of creative intuition, it is its complement. The default mode network is active during intuitive thinking and creative insight. When the brain is not focused on a specific external task, when you are daydreaming, mind-wandering, or resting, a network of brain regions called the default mode network becomes more active. For a long time, this network was considered simply the brain's idle state. More recent research has revealed that it plays an important role in self-referential thinking, social cognition, mental time travel, imagining the past and future, and creative association. The default mode network appears to be particularly active during incubation periods and immediately before creative insights. Daydreaming, walking without a specific cognitive goal, and the hypnagogic state between waking and sleep are all associated with increased default mode activity and with the spontaneous emergence of solutions to problems that effortful thinking had not resolved. Moral intuitions often arrive before moral reasoning. When people are asked to make rapid moral judgments, particularly about scenarios that are emotionally vivid or personally distressing, they typically experience the moral judgment as a direct intuition. This feels wrong, or this feels right, before any explicit reasoning has occurred. Research by Jonathan Haidt and others suggests that moral reasoning, in many cases, occurs after the intuitive judgment rather than before it. The conscious mind constructs justifications for what the emotional system has already decided. This is not always the case. Reflection and deliberate reasoning can and do override initial intuitive moral reactions. But the frequency with which intuition leads and reasoning follows has important implications for how we understand moral disagreement. When two people reach opposite moral conclusions about the same situation, they may be starting from different intuitions and reasoning toward different justifications, making genuine dialogue difficult unless both are willing to examine the felt response rather than just the argument. Intuition can be trained through deliberate attention to outcomes. The development of reliable intuition is not passive. It requires active engagement with the feedback loop that allows the brain to calibrate its pattern recognition. If you make a judgment, pay attention to how it turns out. If you have a hunch about a person, a project, or a situation, know what you expected and compare it with what actually happened. Over time, this deliberate tracking of intuitive predictions and their outcomes develops a more accurate sense of where your intuition tends to be reliable and where it tends to drift. You can also strengthen intuition in specific domains by seeking out high-quality feedback in those domains. By putting yourself in situations where you can make judgments and quickly learn whether they were accurate. Expertise is, at its core, the product of this iterative process carried out over thousands of repetitions. Writing down your gut feelings before making a decision can reveal patterns over time. Keeping a record of intuitive judgments, noting what you felt before a decision, what you chose, and what happened, creates a data set that allows you to evaluate your own predictive accuracy over time. This practice, simple in concept and requiring only a few sentences per entry, can reveal things that are otherwise invisible. Domains where your gut feelings are reliably accurate, situations where anxiety routinely generates false alarms, types of people or environments where your reading tends to be skewed by prior experience. Over months and years, this kind of reflective journaling becomes a genuine tool for understanding your own mind, not in a vague self-help sense, but in the precise, empirically grounded sense of someone building a record of their own cognitive performance and using it to improve. The feeling of familiarity is not the same as actual knowledge. The human brain has a strong tendency to interpret ease of processing as a signal of truth or correctness. Things that are familiar, that we have encountered before, that fit easily into existing categories, that come to mind without effort, feel more credible, more likely to be true, more trustworthy than unfamiliar things. This processing fluency effect means that a statement printed in clear, easy-to-read type feels more true than the same statement in difficult-to-read type. A name encountered before feels more famous than one encountered for the first time. A claim repeated multiple times becomes more believable simply through repetition. This creates a significant vulnerability. False information, repeated often enough, can generate the same intuitive feeling of correctness as genuine knowledge, making it genuinely difficult to distinguish familiarity from understanding by introspection alone. Intuition about risk is often calibrated to evolutionary rather than modern environments. Human beings evolved in environments where certain risks were common and others were effectively non-existent. The risks that our ancestors faced, predators, social rejection, contaminated food, aggressive conspecifics, were the ones that natural selection tuned our intuitive threat detection systems to respond to. The risks of the modern world, statistical risks of financial decisions, long-term health risks of dietary choices, complex systemic risks of technological failures, are largely absent from the environment in which our intuitive systems developed. As a result, our gut feelings about risk can be poorly calibrated to modern decision contexts. We fear spiders more than cars, strangers more than familiar abusers, and flying more than driving. despite the statistical realities. Recognizing this mismatch between our intuitive risk sensors and modern risk landscapes is the beginning of making better decisions in a world our nervous systems were not designed for. Intuition operates differently when you are tired, hungry, or stressed. The quality of intuitive judgment is not constant. It varies with physiological state. When you are fatigued, glucose depleted, or under acute stress, the brain's resources are preferentially allocated to immediate concerns and away from the more sophisticated forms of pattern integration that support high-quality intuition. Tired minds are more likely to make impulsive choices, to fall back on familiar options without adequate consideration, and to misread social signals. Stressed minds are more likely to interpret ambiguous cues as threatening and to respond to the feeling of urgency rather than the actual requirements of the situation. One of the most practically important insights from the psychology of decision-making is therefore simple but easy to ignore. Important decisions made in a depleted state are systematically worse than the same decisions made when rested and calm. This is not a weakness of character. It is the predictable behavior of a biological system under resource constraint. The sense of knowing something without knowing how you know it is called noetic quality. William James, one of the founders of modern psychology, described mystical and intuitive experiences as having a quality he called noetic, a sense of genuine insight or revelation, of having accessed real knowledge that is intrinsically convincing to the person experiencing it. This noetic quality, the feeling that a realization is real, true, and important, is a genuine feature of certain cognitive states. The problem is that the noetic feeling is not itself evidence that the insight is accurate. Strong conviction of knowing, experienced as an intuition, can be the product of genuine insight or of self-reinforcing bias, of deep expertise, or of deeply flawed pattern recognition. The feeling of certainty tells you something important about your own state of mind. It is less reliable as a guide to the accuracy of what you feel certain about. Flow states are associated with the highest expression of embodied intuition. The experience of flow, the state of effortless absorption in a challenging activity that psychologist Mihai Csikszentmihalyi described across decades of research, involves a distinctive suspension of self-monitoring and deliberate decision-making in favor of a fluid, responsive engagement that operates largely through intuition. Athletes, musicians, surgeons, writers, and others who enter flow describe a sense of actions arising without deliberate effort, of the right move presenting itself naturally, of knowing what to do before thinking about it. This state is possible only within domains of genuine expertise. It requires years of practice to build the pattern library that makes flow-based action reliable. Flow is not beginner's luck or random inspiration. It is the highest expression of internalized expertise, made available through the suspension of self-conscious monitoring. Intuition in navigation was highly developed in pre-technological cultures. Before GPS, before compass-based navigation, and in some cases before written charts, the wayfinders of the Pacific navigated thousands of kilometers of open ocean in small vessels, reaching specific islands with reliable accuracy. They did this not through guesswork, but through the systematic reading of environmental signals that most modern people have lost the sensitivity to detect. The angle and period of ocean swells, which carry information about distant land masses, the color and temperature of the water, the behavior of birds and fish, the patterns of stars, the smell of certain plant species that carry offshore. This navigation was not entirely unconscious. It was taught, practiced, and explicitly articulated within these cultures, but it operated through a form of pattern recognition that was deeply embodied and environmental. built through a lifetime of exposure to the sea. It is one of the most impressive demonstrations of what human intuition can achieve when it is systematically developed within a rich and feedback-rich environment. Meditation and mindfulness practices can improve the quality of intuitive perception. One of the most consistent effects of sustained mindfulness practice is an increase in what researchers call interoceptive awareness, the ability to perceive and interpret signals from within the body. Since much of what we experience as intuition is mediated by body-based signals, the felt sense of ease or resistance, the tightening in the chest, the quality of a breath, improvements in interoceptive awareness can translate directly into improvements in the quality and reliability of intuitive perception. People who meditate regularly tend to report a cleaner signal, a clearer sense of the difference between genuine felt responses and the noise of anxious rumination. This is not a mystical effect. It is the natural consequence of developing the skill of attending, without reactivity, to whatever is present in the body, a skill that, once developed, extends beyond the meditation session into everyday life. Social intuition is partly learned and partly innate, with significant individual variation. The capacity to read other people, to infer mental states, emotions, and intentions from behavior, varies significantly across individuals and is influenced by both genetic factors and developmental experience. At one end of the spectrum, people with high levels of what researchers call empathic accuracy are able to track the moment-to-moment emotional states of others with remarkable precision. At the other end, certain conditions, including autism spectrum disorder, involve significant differences in the intuitive reading of social signals, particularly nonverbal ones, while leaving other forms of intelligence intact. Most people fall somewhere between these extremes, with social intuition shaped by early attachment experiences, the quality of childhood social environments, and the accumulated experience of navigating social relationships across a lifetime. Social intuition is not fixed. It can be refined through deliberate practice, reflective attention, and the genuine curiosity to understand what other people are experiencing. The gut-brain axis connects intestinal activity to emotional and intuitive states. The enteric nervous system, a network of more than 100 million neurons lining the digestive tract, is sometimes called the second brain, and it has a bidirectional communication pathway with the central nervous system through the vagus nerve. This gut-brain axis means that the state of the digestive system influences mood, anxiety levels, and decision-making in measurable ways. Disruptions to the gut microbiome have been linked to changes in mood and cognitive function. The vagus nerve carries signals from the gut to the brain that influence the autonomic state, the degree of relaxation or activation of the nervous system, in ways that color the felt sense of a situation. When people describe a gut feeling, they may be, quite literally, describing a signal arising from the enteric nervous system and transmitted to the brain. The idiom is more accurate than it might seem. Hunches in financial decision-making are sometimes accurate, but often overconfident. The world of financial markets is one in which the temptation to trust intuition is high, and the actual reliability of intuitive judgment is, for most people, low. Financial markets are complex adaptive systems in which many highly intelligent, well-resourced actors are simultaneously trying to exploit the same predictive signals, which tends to eliminate the most obvious patterns and make genuine prediction difficult. Research on actively managed funds consistently shows that on average, they do not outperform passive index funds, even when managed by experienced professionals. Individual traders who rely primarily on intuitive judgment tend to trade too frequently, each trade generating costs, and to hold losing positions too long and sell winning ones too soon. The intuitions that work well in domains with reliable patterns and clear feedback are far less reliable in environments designed, in effect, by the adaptive behavior of many other intuition-dependent actors. Intuition in medicine has a distinguished history alongside its failures. Medicine is a domain in which intuition has both saved lives and cost them, sometimes in ways that are difficult to untangle. Experienced clinicians develop genuine intuition about patients, a sense, sometimes barely articulable, that a patient is about to deteriorate, that a diagnosis doesn't quite fit, that a seemingly stable situation is less stable than it appears. Studies of expert clinical judgment in emergency medicine and intensive care have documented cases in which nurses and physicians identified life-threatening changes in patients before any measurable physiological parameter had crossed a threshold. At the same time, medical history is full of examples in which confident clinical intuition resisted the evidence. The germ theory of disease was vigorously rejected on intuitive grounds by physicians who felt that they already understood the causes of illness. Intuitive confidence and genuine accuracy are different things, and medicine has learned, painfully and repeatedly, the importance of subjecting clinical intuition to systematic empirical testing. Unconscious priming can bias intuitive judgments without awareness. Priming refers to the effect of prior exposure to a stimulus on the subsequent processing of related information. Exposing someone to words related to age and frailty makes them walk more slowly afterward, without any awareness of the connection. Priming someone with images of clean environments increases expressions of moral strictness. Hearing a piece of music can prime the emotional tone in which subsequent information is interpreted. These priming effects operate below the threshold of conscious awareness and can color intuitive judgments in ways that feel entirely natural and internally generated. When you meet someone and feel immediately wary, you may be responding to something genuinely concerning about them. Or you may be under the influence of a prior experience, a recent conversation, or an ambient environmental cue that has nothing to do with the person in front of you. The primed judgment feels indistinguishable from the genuine one. Intuition and deliberation work best in combination rather than in competition. The most consistently useful approach to significant decisions, supported by both research and the accounts of consistently effective decision-makers, involves neither pure intuition nor pure analysis, but a dialogue between the two. Intuition is valuable for generating hypotheses, flagging important signals, and acting quickly when time is genuinely short. Deliberate analysis is valuable for checking intuitive conclusions against evidence, identifying potential biases, and evaluating options in domains where intuitive judgment is known to be unreliable. The question to ask of any decision is not whether to use intuition or reason, but which aspects of the decision are better handled by which kind of process, and then to use each appropriately. This requires a degree of self-knowledge, an accurate map of your own domains of reliable intuition and your own characteristic biases, built up over years of reflection and feedback. Intuition about one's own body, interoception, can guide health and self-care. The capacity to accurately perceive signals from within the body, the felt sense of hunger versus appetite, fatigue versus laziness, the quality of different types of physical discomfort, the subtle shifts in energy or mood that precede illness, is an important and often underdeveloped form of intuition. In a culture that encourages external standards over internal experience, many people become somewhat disconnected from interoceptive signals, relying on schedules and rules rather than bodily cues to guide eating, sleeping, and rest. Developing greater interoceptive accuracy through practices that cultivate present-moment awareness of bodily experience can improve not only self-care, but decision-making more broadly, since interoceptive signals are also the channel through which somatic markers and gut feelings are communicated. The body is continuously transmitting information. The question is whether the mind is calibrated to receive it. Collective intuition emerges in well-coordinated teams and long-term partnerships. Intuition is often discussed as an individual phenomenon, but it also has important collective dimensions. Long-term partners, whether in intimate relationships, creative collaborations, or professional teams, develop a shared understanding of each other's patterns, preferences, and ways of thinking that allows them to anticipate each other's moves, fill in each other's gaps, and coordinate without extensive explicit communication. Jazz musicians improvising together, long-married couples navigating a conversation, pairs of surgeons who have worked together for years, all demonstrate forms of collective intuitive coordination that are not fully reducible to the intuition of any individual member. This collective knowing is built through accumulated shared experience and the development of a common vocabulary of implicit signals. It is one of the most sophisticated expressions of what human social intelligence can achieve. The intuition of the wrong feeling is often the most important one to notice. Of all the intuitive signals that pass through awareness in the course of a day, the one most consistently worth pausing on is the subtle sense that something is not right, that a situation, a statement, or a relationship contains a misalignment that hasn't yet revealed itself clearly. This feeling of wrongness is often the most specific and actionable of intuitive signals. It points toward something, even if what it points toward isn't yet clear. It may be that an explanation doesn't fully add up, that a person's words and body language are slightly out of sync, that a plan contains an assumption that hasn't been examined. When this feeling surfaces, the most useful response is not to dismiss it and not to act on it immediately, but to hold it as a question and look for the specific observation that might resolve it. Sometimes the wrongness turns out to be projection or anxiety. Often enough, it turns out to have been right. The hot hand belief illustrates how intuition misreads streaks. The hot hand fallacy, the widespread belief, especially in sports, that a player who has made several consecutive successful shots is more likely to make the next one, has been extensively studied and debated. Intuition strongly generates the hot hand belief. A player who is on feels different, the crowd responds differently, teammates seek to pass to them, and it genuinely seems as if performance clusters in ways that defy randomness. For decades, this intuition was dismissed by statistical analysis as a fallacy. Streaks, the argument went, are expected features of random sequences that the mind misreads as meaningful patterns. More recent and more nuanced analyses have complicated this picture, finding modest evidence for genuine streak effects in some sports contexts. What the debate reveals is that intuition about patterns and noisy data is neither simply right nor simply wrong. It is responding to something real, but processing it through a system that tends to see patterns more readily than they actually exist. Intuition about time and timing is a distinct cognitive capacity. Apart from intuition about facts, people, or decisions, there is a specific form of intuitive ability that concerns timing, the sense of when to act, when to wait, when a moment has arrived or passed. This timing intuition is evident in the performance of experienced athletes who know when to commit to a move, in musicians who know when to begin a phrase and when to hold back, in negotiators who know when the other party is ready to move, in parents who know when a child is reaching a tipping point. This sense of timing is not easily articulated. It operates through a felt sense of readiness or ripeness rather than through explicit reasoning, but it is often remarkably accurate, in people who have developed it through extensive experience in their domain. And like other forms of intuition, it is domain-specific. The musician's timing intuition doesn't transfer automatically to the negotiating table. Intuitive processing can happen during sleep. The brain's capacity for unconscious processing does not shut down during sleep. In fact, sleep, particularly REM sleep, which is associated with the activation of large-scale cortical networks and with vivid dreaming, appears to be a period of intensive associative processing in which the brain makes connections between disparate pieces of information. Several well-documented cases of scientific and creative insight have come during sleep or in the moments of waking. Dmitry Mendeleev reportedly saw the arrangement of the periodic table in a dream. August Kekulé described the ring structure of benzene after a waking dream of a snake biting its own tail. Paul McCartney heard the melody of Yesterday complete in a dream. These are exceptional cases, but the underlying mechanism, unconscious associative processing during sleep producing integrations unavailable to waking deliberation, is a genuine feature of cognition. Sleeping on a problem is not avoidance. It is, sometimes, the most productive form of working on it. Intuition in experienced parents reflects a vast store of implicit knowledge about a specific child. Parents of young children, particularly those who have developed a close and attentive relationship with a child, develop a form of intuition about that specific child that is highly accurate within its domain. They know, from subtle cues of expression, posture, and energy, when the child is getting sick before any obvious symptom has appeared. They can distinguish a cry that signals pain from one that signals frustration from one that signals overstimulation, based on nuances of pitch, rhythm, and context that they could not easily articulate. This parental intuition is not instinct in the simple biological sense. It is expertise about a particular person, built through thousands of hours of attentive observation and calibrated by the feedback of a close relationship. It is one of the most poignant examples of how intimacy generates a form of knowing. The sense of direction and spatial intuition varies significantly between individuals. Some people maintain an accurate sense of their orientation in space even when they cannot see their surroundings or reference any landmark. They know, in an unfamiliar city, which direction they came from. They can find their car in a parking lot with reliable ease. They navigate a building they visited only once without getting lost. Others find spatial orientation effortful and frequently unreliable. This variation appears to reflect both innate differences in the function of the hippocampus, the brain region central to spatial memory and navigation, and the effects of experience and practice. Cultures in which navigation is a daily survival skill tend to produce individuals with highly developed spatial intuition. The use of GPS navigation for everyday travel may be gradually reducing the cultivation of spatial intuition in urban populations, a hypothesis that several researchers are currently investigating. Intuition about danger can be cultivated by studying the environment carefully. Among the most practically important developments in the psychology of safety and security is the recognition that the intuitive sense of danger, the feeling that something is wrong in an environment even before any specific threat has been identified, can be deliberately cultivated. Security professionals, military personnel, and first responders can develop what is sometimes called situational awareness, a continuous, low-level monitoring of environmental patterns that generates a felt sense of baseline normalcy and flags deviations from it. The training that develops this awareness involves learning to notice what is present, to notice what is absent that should be present, to track the behavior of people in relation to their apparent context, and to trust the felt sense of incongruence as a signal worth investigating. This cultivated danger intuition is not paranoia. It is pattern recognition trained to a specific and legitimate purpose. Implicit learning occurs without conscious awareness of the rules being learned. One of the most remarkable demonstrations that intuition can be accurate comes from research on implicit learning, the process by which people learn complex rules governing sequences or structures without being able to articulate those rules. In a classic paradigm, participants are exposed to strings of letters generated by a complex grammar with no knowledge that there is a grammar. After extended exposure, they develop the ability to judge, at better than chance rates, whether new letter strings follow the same grammar. They can do this even though they cannot state the rules. Their knowledge is real, but it exists in a form that is inaccessible to conscious report. This is a laboratory model of the kind of intuitive expertise that develops in any domain with complex, regular patterns. The feel for what fits without being able to say exactly why, grounded in implicit knowledge that is genuine but unverbalizable. The power of weak signals, barely conscious perceptions, should not be underestimated. Some of the most important intuitive perceptions are weak ones, barely conscious flickers of impression that are easily overridden by louder cognitive activity. A momentary sense that a detail doesn't fit, a vague feeling that something is being unsaid, a slight hesitation before a response that felt completely normal in every other way. These weak signals are easy to ignore precisely because they are weak. They don't press themselves on attention in the way that strong emotional reactions do. But they may contain genuine information, precisely because they are pre-reflective. They arise before the conscious mind has had a chance to rationalize or to selectively attend. One of the most valuable habits associated with good judgment is the practice of noticing these weak signals, not necessarily acting on them immediately, but holding them long enough to ask what they might be pointing toward. Cultural differences shape what information intuition draws on. The content of intuitive judgment is not universal. It is shaped by the cultural frameworks, social norms, and environmental cues that a person has been immersed in from birth. Research in cross-cultural psychology has documented that people from different cultural backgrounds make systematically different intuitive attributions about the same behavior. What a Western European observer intuitively reads as individual assertiveness may be read by an East Asian observer as social disruption. What feels obviously correct as a response to conflict in one cultural setting can feel obviously wrong in another. These differences are not simply differences in explicit belief. They operate at the level of automatic, intuitive response, reflecting the degree to which cultural frameworks have been internalized as implicit assumptions about what behavior means. Cross-cultural competence involves developing the awareness that one's own intuitions are culturally situated, that they are not neutral readings of universal human nature, but trained responses to particular social environments. The feeling of moral disgust can override rational deliberation. The emotion of disgust, originally an evolutionary adaptation for avoiding contaminated food and disease, has been co-opted in human social life to enforce moral norms and signal violations of purity, sanctity, and social boundaries. Experimental research has shown that inducing disgust, even through physically unrelated means like exposure to a bad smell or an uncomfortable environment, increases the severity of moral judgments about unrelated scenarios. The reverse is also true. Removing disgust responses can make people more permissive about behaviors they would otherwise find unacceptable. This suggests that some of what feels like deeply held moral intuition is partly an emotional state that can be influenced by factors having nothing to do with the moral question at hand. The felt certainty of a moral reaction is not evidence of its validity. it is evidence that the emotional system has been activated, which may or may not be appropriate to the actual situation. Intuitive expertise in reading poker tells is a domain of social pattern recognition. The ability to read subtle behavioral signals, physical tells, in the faces and bodies of other players is one of the most valued and most difficult skills in high-stakes poker. Professional players develop the ability to notice micro-variations in breathing rate, the way chips are handled, the timing of bet decisions, and the quality of eye contact that can provide probabilistic information about the cards an opponent holds. This is not a mystical gift. It is a specific application of social pattern recognition, cultivated through thousands of hours of play with feedback. It is also a domain in which overconfident intuition can be extremely costly. Tells are probabilistic signals in a noisy environment, not reliable indicators. The best players combine intuitive reading of opponents with a sophisticated probabilistic framework that prevents them from placing too much weight on any single signal. Intuitive responses to nature have deep evolutionary and neurological roots. Human beings respond to natural environments, to open landscapes with trees and water, to birdsong, to the sound of moving water, in ways that are consistent across cultures and that appear to have evolutionary origins in the environments where human cognition developed. Research by Rachel and Stephen Kaplan on attention restoration theory found that natural environments restore directed attentional capacity more effectively than urban environments, partly because they engage what the Kaplans called fascination, effortless, involuntary attention that doesn't deplete the resources required for focused concentration. The intuitive sense of calm and restored clarity that many people experience after time in a natural environment is not simply a preference or a cultural association. It appears to reflect a genuine alignment between specific environmental features and the optimal functioning of the human nervous system, a form of environmental intuition that is among the oldest and most reliable we possess. Intuition in athletics involves reading opponents, not just responding to the ball. The intuitive processing of an elite athlete extends far beyond rapid reaction to an immediate stimulus. A top tennis player does not simply wait to see where the ball is going and then respond. They are already reading the opponent's grip, shoulder rotation, and weight distribution in the moment before the ball is struck, generating a probabilistic prediction of where the ball will go that guides their movement before the ball has left the racket. A skilled basketball player is reading the likely intentions of multiple players simultaneously, using patterns of movement and body orientation to anticipate how a play will develop. This anticipatory intuition, which allows elite athletes to appear to have more time than their opponents, is the product of years of exposure to the specific visual patterns of their sport, encoded as implicit knowledge that makes prediction feel effortless. Dreams sometimes process emotional and relational material in ways that surface as clarified intuition. Beyond the role of sleep in solving cognitive problems, the dreaming mind appears to engage with emotional and relational material in distinctive ways. Dreams often seem to strip away the social rationalizations and politeness conventions that shape waking emotional processing, engaging more directly with underlying feelings about people, relationships, and situations. Many people report waking from a dream with a clarified emotional sense about a situation that had felt confused the night before, not because the dream literally showed them the answer, but because the dreaming mind processed the material from a different angle and surfaced an emotional truth that waking deliberation had obscured. The mechanism is not well understood, but it appears related to the emotional reprocessing function of REM sleep, during which emotional memories are reprocessed in a neurochemical environment characterized by low norepinephrine, a state associated with reduced anxiety and increased emotional flexibility. Language shapes the intuitions we can articulate, but not all intuitions that exist. One of the most interesting insights from the study of intuition and language is the asymmetry between them. We have more intuitive knowledge than we have words for. In every language, there are concepts, particularly for emotional and social experiences, that exist in some cultures and not others, and that speakers of languages containing those concepts can distinguish with reliable accuracy in subtle situations where speakers of languages without them may notice something without being able to name it. But the existence of a word is not the same as the existence of the underlying experience. The experience may exist without the word. Intuition can operate in the territory beyond language, in the spaces between named emotions, in the qualities of experience that don't have agreed-upon labels, in the perceptual subtleties that exist but haven't been codified. Language is a tool for communicating and sharing intuition, but it is not its container. The experience of rightness in a well-made decision has a distinctive felt quality. Decision researchers and people who have studied their own decision-making carefully over long periods report that well-made decisions reached through an appropriate integration of intuitive and analytical processing, often have a distinctive felt quality at the moment they are made. The decision feels settled rather than resolved. There is a quality of quietness about it, rather than the relief of having escaped uncertainty. The mind stops generating objections and counterarguments not because they have been suppressed, but because they no longer feel pressing. This quality of settledness is not infallible as a guide. It can be produced by closure seeking in situations where closure is premature. But when it arrives in the context of genuine deliberation that has engaged both feeling and reasoning, it is a useful signal that something real has been found. Intuition about what to create, aesthetic intuition, guides artists toward coherent work. Among the most important forms of intuition for creative work is aesthetic intuition, the felt sense of whether something is working or not, whether a sentence, a chord progression, a composition, or a design is moving in the right direction. This form of intuition is both deeply personal and, in skilled practitioners, surprisingly accurate as a guide to what will resonate more broadly. Artists develop aesthetic intuition through years of exposure to work in their medium, absorbing the patterns of what works and what doesn't, building an implicit standard against which their own work is continuously evaluated. This implicit standard operates below full articulation. The artist often knows the work isn't right before they can say precisely what's wrong with it, and feels when it becomes right before they can fully articulate why. Aesthetic intuition is, in this sense, a form of expertise expressing itself as feeling. The neuroscience of intuition points toward integrated processing across brain regions. When neuroscientists study the neural basis of intuitive versus deliberative decision-making, what they find is not a simple division between emotional and rational brain regions. Intuitive processing involves the integration of signals from multiple brain systems. The basal ganglia, which store procedural and implicit knowledge, the anterior cingulate cortex, which monitors for conflict and unexpected outcomes, the insula, which processes interoceptive signals and contributes to the felt sense of a decision, the amygdala, which generates rapid emotional appraisals, and various prefrontal regions that integrate these signals and regulate the emotional response. A felt sense of knowing is not generated by a single brain region. It is the product of a distributed network, integrating information from many sources into a unified experiential signal. This integrated architecture is part of what makes intuition so hard to explain. It is the product of processes too distributed and too parallel to be captured in any simple sequential account. Humility about intuition is itself a form of wisdom. The most consistently effective decision-makers studied in the research literature share a distinctive quality. They trust their intuition in the domains where it is well-grounded, and they are genuinely humble about it in domains where it is not. This calibrated confidence, knowing when to rely on the gut and when to check it, is more reliable than either wholesale trust in intuition or wholesale rejection of it. It requires an honest assessment of one's own experience, an accurate sense of where feedback has been clear and where it hasn't, and the intellectual honesty to notice when a strong feeling might be driven by wish or fear rather than genuine pattern recognition. Developing this calibrated relationship with one's own intuitive processes may be one of the most valuable forms of self-knowledge available, and it is not acquired once, but refined continuously over a lifetime of paying attention. The placebo effect demonstrates the power of expectation-driven intuition. When a patient takes a sugar pill believing it to be a real medication, the belief itself can produce measurable physiological changes, reductions in pain, improvements in mood, alterations in immune function. The placebo effect is not mere imagination or wishful thinking. It is the brain's predictive processing system acting on the expectation that a treatment will work, generating real neurochemical changes in anticipation of an expected outcome. This mechanism is closely related to intuition. Both involve the brain acting on predictions rather than waiting for certainty. The placebo effect is, in a sense, the most dramatic demonstration available of how powerfully the mind's anticipatory models can shape physical reality. Understanding it doesn't diminish it. It reveals something profound about the relationship between expectation, perception, and experience that applies far beyond medicine. Intuition about language develops before the child can speak. Long before an infant produces its first word, the brain is performing an extraordinary feat of statistical analysis on the sounds it hears. Infants track the frequency with which different sounds occur together and in sequence, extracting statistical regularities that encode the sound structure of their native language. By the age of 6 months, they already respond differently to sounds native to their language versus sounds from foreign languages. By 8 months, they are segmenting continuous speech into word-sized units using statistical patterns in the stream of sound. None of this is conscious. None of it is taught explicitly. It is intuitive learning through immersion, the absorption of pattern from experience without any explicit rule instruction. It is also, in a very direct sense, the foundation of all subsequent language acquisition. The implicit statistical knowledge of sound patterns that makes words feel like words and sentences feel like sentences rather than arbitrary streams of noise. Learned helplessness can suppress intuitive competence in familiar domains. When people experience repeated failure in a domain, particularly failure that appears unrelated to their actions, they can develop a state of learned helplessness, a generalized expectation of ineffectiveness that suppresses initiative, reduces persistence, and narrows the range of responses they generate in problem situations. This state can suppress intuitive competence even in areas where the person has genuine skills. A student who has experienced repeated academic failure may stop trusting their intuition about whether they understand material, even in subjects where their understanding is sound. A person who has experienced repeated rejection in relationships may stop trusting their intuitive sense of whether a potential partner is interested, becoming unable to act on clear signals. Recovering from learned helplessness involves rebuilding trust in one's own perceptions, a process that requires small successes with clear feedback accumulated over time. The feeling of déjà vu is a form of miscalibrated familiarity signal. Déjà vu, the uncanny feeling of having experienced a current situation before, despite knowing that this is impossible, is one of the most striking examples of the familiarity signal behaving abnormally. Research suggests that déjà vu occurs when the brain's familiarity detection system activates in the absence of the corresponding recollection system. That is, when something triggers the feeling of having been seen before without the associated memory of when or where. This can happen when a current scene closely resembles a previously encountered scene in its spatial or structural features without being consciously recognized as similar. It can also occur as a brief neurological event during which the familiarity circuitry fires without adequate input. Déjà vu is not evidence of past life memory or mystical experience. It is a window into the otherwise invisible machinery of familiarity recognition, briefly misfiring in a way that becomes consciously available. Intuition about social hierarchies develops early and operates largely automatically. Humans are extraordinarily sensitive to social status and power, and this sensitivity operates to a significant degree through automatic, intuitive processes rather than conscious deliberation. Research has shown that people can make accurate judgments about relative social status from brief exposures to photographs of faces, to body language, or to vocal characteristics at better than chance rates. They adjust their own behavior automatically in response to status cues, speaking differently, taking different amounts of space, making different levels of eye contact, without being consciously aware of having detected or responded to the relevant cues. This automatic status sensitivity is thought to reflect the importance of hierarchy navigation in group-living species, where position in the social structure has significant consequences for access to resources, safety, and reproductive opportunity. The social dynamics of any human group generate a continuous stream of status information that intuition reads and responds to before conscious deliberation has had a chance to weigh in. Mindset affects the quality of intuitive processing. The mental state in which you approach a problem influences not only the deliberate thinking you bring to it, but also the quality of the intuitive processing that accompanies it. Research by psychologist A.P. Dijkstra-Ruiz and others on what he called the unconscious thought theory found, in a series of studies, that complex decisions involving many attributes were sometimes better handled by directing attention away from the decision for a period of time, allowing unconscious processing to integrate the information, than by deliberate analysis. The effect appears to depend on the complexity of the decision and the richness of the available information. For simple decisions, deliberate analysis is typically superior. For genuinely complex decisions involving many interacting considerations, allowing the unconscious to process may sometimes produce better integration than effortful conscious analysis can achieve. The best approach may depend on accurately assessing which kind of problem you're facing. Emotional granularity, the ability to distinguish fine-grained emotional states, improves intuitive self-regulation. People vary enormously in how precisely they can identify and distinguish their own emotional states. Some people experience emotional life in broad categories, feeling good or bad, up or down, anxious or calm. Others have what psychologist Lisa Feldman Barrett calls high emotional granularity, the ability to distinguish between disappointment and sadness, between apprehension and dread, between contentment and joy, between irritation and anger. This fine-grained emotional awareness turns out to matter for intuitive self-regulation. People with high emotional granularity are better able to identify the specific source of a distressing feeling, which makes them more effective at choosing an appropriate response. They are less likely to misread the source of their distress, to attribute a feeling of hunger to anxiety or a feeling of ambient low mood to a specific situation, and more able to act on genuine information rather than on misattributed signals. The overjustification effect shows that too much analysis can undermine genuine intuition. When people are asked to explain the reasons for their aesthetic preferences, why they like a particular painting, or which jam they prefer, the verbalization of reasons can actually reduce the accuracy of their preferences. This overjustification effect occurs because the act of generating verbal reasons biases attention toward aspects of the choice that are easy to articulate rather than those that drive genuine preference. People end up choosing the option that is easiest to justify rather than the option they actually prefer. This suggests that in domains of aesthetic and experiential judgment, where the relevant information is richly processed but not easily verbalized, articulating reasons for a choice can interfere with rather than illuminate genuine intuitive preference. Sometimes the wisest response to an intuitive knowing is not to interrogate it, but to act on it before the analytical mind imposes a framework that distorts what was genuinely felt. The timing of sleep and circadian rhythms affects the quality of morning versus evening intuition. The brain's functioning varies across the day in ways that influence both the type of thinking most accessible and the quality of intuitive processing. Many people find that morning hours, when the prefrontal cortex is rested and the brain's inhibitory control is at its peak, are best for focused analytical work, while late morning and early evening hours can be particularly fruitful for associative, intuitive thinking. The relaxed alertness of the late evening, in the hours before sleep, can be a fertile time for the kind of loose, associative processing from which creative intuition tends to emerge. The transitional states between waking and sleeping, hypnagogia as you drift off, hypnopompia as you wake, are associated with unusual states of consciousness in which unexpected connections and insights sometimes surface. Many creative people have developed practices that deliberately engage these transitional states. Keeping a notebook beside the bed, or using a technique Thomas Edison allegedly used of holding ball bearings while falling asleep, so that the sound of them dropping when he drifted off would wake him and allow him to capture the hypnagogic imagery that preceded sleep. Intuitive expertise in reading written text develops through immense quantities of reading experience. The experience of fluent reading, the way that a skilled reader absorbs the meaning of text automatically, without consciously attending to individual words, is a form of highly trained intuitive processing. Fluent readers have, through years of practice, built up an automated system that recognizes word patterns, grammatical structures, and semantic relationships with extraordinary speed. This automaticity allows cognitive resources to be directed upward toward comprehension, inference, and critical evaluation rather than being consumed by decoding. The development of reading fluency is, in this sense, a process of converting deliberate, effortful processing into intuitive, automatic processing, the same trajectory that characterizes the development of expertise in any complex skill domain. What was once conscious becomes intuitive. What was once effortful becomes effortless. And the gains in cognitive capacity that this frees up make possible higher and higher levels of engagement with meaning. Intuition about honesty is better than chance, but far from perfect. People believe themselves to be better than chance at detecting deception, and research confirms that they are, but only slightly. Across dozens of studies, the average accuracy of human deception detection from behavioral cues alone is around 54%, only marginally above the 50% expected by chance. Trained professionals, police officers, customs agents, psychiatrists, perform no better on average than college students. The cues that people believe indicate deception, gaze aversion, excessive fidgeting, nervous laughter, are not reliably associated with actual deception. The cues that are more reliably associated with deception, subtle asymmetries in facial expression, slight hesitations in speech, micro changes in vocal pitch, are not the ones intuition tends to monitor. The intuitive sense of whether someone is being honest is therefore real. It is genuine pattern recognition, but it is drawing on an imperfect model of what honesty and deception look like, one that has been shaped by cultural stereotypes as much as by genuine observation. The mind's tendency to seek coherent narratives can override accurate intuitive signals. Human beings are storytelling creatures, and the mind has a powerful tendency to organize experience into coherent narratives with causes, intentions, and meanings. This narrative drive can distort intuitive judgment when it leads the mind to impose a coherent story on a situation where the actual information is ambiguous or contradictory. A series of coincidences becomes a meaningful pattern. A relationship with some problems becomes either a love story or a disaster story, depending on which interpretation the mind has committed to. A professional with a strong track record is assumed to have made a sound decision when the evidence is actually unclear. The narrative mind fills gaps with what fits the story, and the resulting judgment can feel deeply intuitive, grounded, settled, certain, while actually being the product of premature narrative closure rather than genuine perception of the situation. Intuition and pattern recognition are involved in reading music from notation. Experienced musicians who can sight read, who can look at a page of musical notation and translate it into sound in real time, are performing a remarkable act of multi-layered pattern recognition that becomes deeply intuitive with practice. They recognize patterns of notes as melodic figures, rhythmic patterns as familiar groupings, harmonic structures as familiar progressions. They don't read individual notes any more than a fluent reader reads individual letters. They read chunks, patterns, and structures that carry meaning at a higher level. The development of sight reading ability is explicitly a process of building intuition through accumulated exposure. The same patterns encountered again and again until recognition becomes automatic and the gap between seeing and sounding narrows to near zero. It is one of the most clear-cut examples of how deliberate practice builds intuitive competence in a domain with complex, learnable structure. Self-compassion supports better intuitive decision-making by reducing fear-based interference. When people make decisions from a place of high self-criticism, where every choice carries the weight of potential self-judgment for failure, the emotional cost of getting things wrong skews decision-making towards safety and avoidance rather than genuine assessment. The result is that fear of negative self-judgment interferes with the accurate reading of intuitive signals. What the situation actually calls for is obscured by what would be safest for the self-image. Self-compassion, the capacity to treat oneself with the same kindness and understanding one would extend to a friend in difficulty, reduces this fear-based interference. Research by Kristen Neff and others has found that self-compassion is associated with greater willingness to acknowledge mistakes, to take creative risks, and to make decisions based on genuine assessment rather than self-protective avoidance. A mind at peace with the possibility of being wrong is a mind that can listen more clearly to what it actually knows. The vagus nerve transmits bottom-up signals from the body that shape intuitive states. The vagus nerve, the longest cranial nerve in the body, running from the brainstem through the neck, chest, and abdomen, is the primary channel through which the body communicates its physiological state to the brain. Signals traveling upward through the vagus nerve inform the brain about the state of the heart, the lungs, the digestive system, and the gut microbiome, among other things. These signals contribute to what the brain calls into being as its current model of the body's safety and readiness. The felt sense of whether the situation is safe or threatening, whether resources are available or depleted, whether engagement or withdrawal is appropriate. Much of what we experience as intuition about situations, the felt sense that something is right or wrong, comfortable or uncomfortable, is shaped by these ascending vagal signals, which provide a continuous bottom-up stream of information about the body's actual state and its relationship to the current environment. Intuitive aesthetic responses to symmetry appear to have evolutionary roots. Across cultures, human beings show a consistent preference for symmetrical faces and bodies, a preference that appears to reflect genuine information about biological quality and developmental stability. Symmetry is difficult to maintain under conditions of stress, disease, and genetic instability during development, so a symmetric face is, statistically, a reliable signal of good health and genetic robustness. The intuitive aesthetic response to symmetry, the immediate, unreflective sense that a face is attractive or a design is pleasing, may therefore be, in part, an evolved information-gathering mechanism dressed as an aesthetic preference. Similar arguments have been made about preferences for certain landscape features: open savanna with trees, proximity to water, elevated viewpoints with good sight lines, which match the features of environments that would have supported survival for early humans. The aesthetics of the body and the landscape may be, at their deepest level, a form of intuitive ecological and biological assessment. The distinction between fast intuition and slow intuition matters for decision quality. Not all intuitive responses are equally fast. Some gut feelings arrive essentially instantaneously. The immediate emotional response to seeing a face, the rapid assessment of a physical environment, the nearly reflexive reading of a social signal. Others emerge more slowly, over hours or days, as the unconscious mind works on a problem and eventually surfaces a direction or a feeling of resolution. These two forms of intuition are somewhat different in their neural basis and in their relationship to experience. The rapid intuition is heavily dependent on the amygdala and other rapid response systems evolved for immediate threat detection. The slower, more considered intuition involves more extensive integration of information across cortical regions and draws on a richer knowledge base. Both are genuine forms of intuition, but they are suited to different kinds of decisions, and the speed of the response is not itself an indicator of its accuracy. Body posture and physical movement can influence the quality of intuitive processing. The relationship between body and mind is bidirectional. Just as emotional states influence posture and movement can influence emotional and cognitive states. Research on embodied cognition has documented that physical postures associated with confidence, openness, or engagement can improve cognitive performance, increase risk tolerance, and generate more optimistic assessments of ambiguous situations. Walking, in particular, has been found to enhance creative thinking and associative processing, the forms of cognition most closely associated with intuitive insight. The experience of walking seems to facilitate the loose, wide-ranging association of ideas that incubation and insight require, perhaps by engaging the default mode network more fully. The advice to take a walk when stuck on a problem is not merely a coping strategy. It may be, in some cases, the most effective cognitive intervention available. The feeling of being watched activates social monitoring systems without visible cause. People frequently report an intuitive sense of being observed, a feeling that draws attention to a specific direction, often correctly revealing that someone is indeed looking at them. This phenomenon, sometimes called gaze detection, has been experimentally studied and found to be real. people can detect a directed gaze at better than chance rates, even in peripheral vision. The mechanism involves specialized neural systems in the superior temporal sulcus that are tuned to the direction of gaze in others' faces. These systems can operate at the edges of conscious attention, generating a felt sense of being watched before any deliberate visual search has confirmed it. In social environments where the direction of others' attention carries significant information about intentions, approval, and threat, a rapid and sensitive gaze detection system has obvious adaptive value, and the intuitive sense it generates is one of the most immediate and visceral forms of social intuition that most people experience. Neuroplasticity means that intuitive systems can be reshaped by new experience at any age. For much of the 20th century, the adult brain was thought to be largely fixed in its organization and function, a finished structure that could no longer be significantly remodeled by experience. Research in neuroplasticity has comprehensively revised this view. The adult brain retains a significant capacity for structural and functional change in response to sustained experience, and this includes the implicit systems that underlie intuitive judgment. Taxi drivers who have spent years navigating complex city street networks develop measurably larger hippocampal volumes. Musicians who practice intensively develop enlarged cortical representations of the hands and fingers. Meditators develop measurable changes in the prefrontal cortex and insula associated with improved self-regulation and interoceptive awareness. The intuitive systems of the adult brain are not fixed. They are continuously shaped by the experiences we choose and the attention we bring to them. The investment in developing intuition in any domain is an investment in literally reshaping the neural architecture that makes it possible. The uncertainty that precedes genuine intuitive knowing is not the same as confusion. There is a quality of mind that precedes the emergence of genuine intuitive clarity that is worth distinguishing from confusion or distress. It is a state of open, receptive not knowing, the feeling of holding a question without forcing an answer, of remaining present with what is not yet clear. This quality is familiar to skilled practitioners in many domains. The therapist who doesn't rush to interpret, the scientist who resists premature conclusions, the leader who waits for the right moment to act. It is a form of cognitive patience that creates space for genuine insight to emerge rather than settling for the first plausible answer. It is not comfortable. The mind has a strong tendency to close uncertainty as quickly as possible because uncertainty is cognitively costly. But the tolerance of uncertainty, held with attentiveness rather than anxiety, is often the condition that allows the most accurate intuitive knowledge to surface. Genuine intuition has a quality of quiet authority that distinguishes it from wishful thinking. Among the most practically important distinctions in working with intuition is the one between what is genuinely known, however quietly and however incompletely, and what is desired. Wishful thinking can generate strong feelings. The excitement of a preferred outcome can feel indistinguishable in the moment from the certainty of a real prediction. But on closer attention, there is often a qualitative difference between the felt sense of genuine intuitive knowing and the felt sense of desire. Genuine knowing tends to be quiet, specific, and relatively stable. It doesn't escalate when questioned. It doesn't feel threatened by the consideration of alternatives. It has a quality of having been there before the wish arrived rather than after it. Desire tends to be louder, more insistent, less specific, and more reactive when challenged. The ability to make this distinction reliably is one of the most hard-won forms of self-knowledge, and it is developed through years of honest reflection on what one has known, what one has wanted, and how often the two have been confused. Integration of intuition and analysis is the hallmark of mature judgment. Across the domains that have been most carefully studied, medicine, military strategy, business, sports, creative work, scientific discovery, the most consistently excellent judgment is characterized not by pure intuition or pure analysis, but by their effective integration. The experienced clinician uses systematic diagnostic protocols informed by an intuitive sense of where to look. The seasoned investor builds rigorous financial models while remaining attuned to the felt sense of organizational culture and leadership that numbers cannot capture. The master chess player calculates deeply in positions that feel sharp and plays intuitively in positions that feel settled. This integration is not a compromise between two opposing approaches. It is the emergence of a genuinely higher form of judgment that uses each tool in the service of the other, allowing intuition to guide attention and analysis to check conclusions, in a continuous dialogue that neither could achieve alone. Intuition about numbers and magnitude is often poorly calibrated for large quantities. Human intuitive number sense, the ability to quickly estimate quantities without counting, works well for small numbers and for comparative judgments, but deteriorates rapidly for large quantities. We are poor at intuitively grasping the difference between 1,000,000 and 1,000,000,000, between a risk of 1 in 1,000 and 1 in 1,000,000, between 1 year and 1,000 years. This limitation of numerical intuition has significant practical consequences. It makes it difficult to evaluate large-scale risks accurately, to understand statistical claims about health and safety, or to make sound intuitive judgments about anything that involves very large or very small quantities. The appropriate response is not to abandon numerical reasoning in favor of gut feeling. It is to recognize that in quantitative domains, the intuition needs to be complemented by explicit calculation, because the quantities involved exceed the range in which human intuitive processing is reliable. The experience of regret can calibrate future intuitive decisions when used well. Regret, the painful recognition that a different choice would have produced a better outcome, is one of the most powerful forms of feedback available to intuitive learning. When experienced constructively, it provides precise information about which aspect of a decision was flawed, whether it was the information gathered, the criterion used, the timing of the decision, or the execution. Over time, the systematic experience of regret, reflected on with curiosity rather than self-punishment, builds a more refined model of one's own decision tendencies, a calibration of where one's judgment tends to be overconfident, where it tends to be unduly cautious, and what types of situations tend to systematically mislead it. The goal is not to avoid regret at all costs, that leads to excessive caution, but to extract the information that regret offers and allow it to refine the intuitive models that guide future choices. The quieter mind hears more. One of the most consistent findings across diverse traditions of contemplative practice and a growing body of empirical research is that reducing the volume of mental noise, the internal chatter of planning, self-evaluation, rumination, and habitual reaction, allows subtler signals to become perceptible. Experienced meditators report an increased sensitivity to fine-grained emotional and perceptual information that is normally drowned out by the louder processes of everyday mental life. Neuroscientific research on experienced meditators has found evidence of enhanced interoceptive processing and improved ability to distinguish between sources of emotional information. The quieter mind is not an emptier mind. It is a mind with a better signal-to-noise ratio, able to attend to information that a busier mind would miss. This may be one of the most fundamental reasons why rest, stillness, and the approach of sleep often bring clarity rather than confusion, as the noise drops. the signal becomes easier to hear. Intuition is ultimately in service of a life well lived rather than an end in itself. The science of intuition, explored from every angle, its neural basis, its relationship to expertise, its vulnerabilities, and its strengths, ultimately points toward a simple practical conclusion. Intuition is not a mystical shortcut to truth, nor is it a source of unreliable noise that should be overridden by analysis whenever possible. It is one of the most powerful cognitive tools available to a human being, most reliable when grounded in genuine experience, most dangerous when inflated by wishful thinking or distorted by fear and bias. Like any tool, it is most valuable when it is well understood, when you know its strengths and its characteristic failure modes, when you know which domains it can be trusted in and which it needs checking. A life in which intuition is cultivated with honesty, tested against experience, and held in productive dialogue with reason is a life in which you can trust your own mind, not blindly, but with the earned confidence of someone who has paid attention. And so tonight, as you settle toward sleep, something that has been with you your whole life is still quietly at work, processing the day, integrating what was experienced, building its models of the world from everything you've seen and felt and learned. Your intuition is not a separate faculty from your intelligence. It is one of the ways your intelligence expresses itself, the compressed form of everything you've come to know, delivered not as an argument, but as a feeling. Sometimes it knows more than your words do. Sometimes it is carrying old fears that no longer apply. And over a lifetime, the skill of telling the difference, of learning which of its signals to follow and which to examine more carefully, is one of the most genuinely useful things a person can develop. You don't have to figure that out tonight. You've thought enough for one day. The mind that has been processing and predicting and evaluating and reading all day long is ready to rest, to do its quieter work in the background while you sleep. Let the thoughts slow. Let the decisions wait until morning. Whatever didn't get resolved today will be easier to see tomorrow, when you've rested, when the signal is cleaner, when the noise has had a chance to settle. The best thing you can do for your judgment right now is to stop using it. Consider subscribing to Some Neuromind. You're already the kind of person this channel was made for, one quiet mind at a time. But for now, let everything go. Rest now. You've earned it. Good night.